Tony Caligiuri worked for the National Wildlife Federation in conservation and also as a chief of staff for some congressmen and was in Washington, D.C. for a number of years. Well, National Wildlife Federation sent him to Colorado to check something out, and he was sold, and then Colorado Open Lands offered him this position, which he's taken. Bev and I, who just spoke, Bev and I have been on a couple of field trips with Colorado Open Lands. They're absolutely fabulous. We had the most wonderful time. So I do encourage you even just from that angle. And Tony's a lot of fun to be with. Let me see. I'm excited for you to hear this talk because he shared a lot of that information with us during the field trip. One of the stories that I loved, we heard a little bit about it, and I heard a little more today when I spoke with Tony. The San Luis Valley, people are always trying to get water from under there. You may remember years ago the water they wanted to get from under the sand dunes, and it was anticipated that the sand dunes would blow away if they did that. That didn't happen. Well, there was another effort that came up recently, and Colorado Open Lands just bought the ranch that had the water rights that they were going to put their well in and access all the water. So there's power in that. I love it. Yeah, just buy it. Just buy the farm. Yeah. And then just in parting, I'm really happy to have Tony be giving this talk. It's very, very makes you feel good, very satisfying. So at the end of my conversation today with him, to kind of be ready to introduce him, I said, is there anything you want me to say about you? And his answer was, the work is interesting. I'm not. I love the humility. Tony, come.
Okay, hopefully this is working. Can you hear me? Okay, terrific. Well, thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about our work at Colorado Open Lands. I thought what I would do is just take a moment to a couple minutes to share a little bit about first why we do what we do, and then a little bit about how we do what we do. And then love to take your questions, comments, and things like that at the end. So I just wanted to start out just real quick. Overall, as an organization, Colorado Open Lands is a statewide organization that works to protect land and water in conservation for wildlife and people. And so we have kind of a mission of not only to protect land and water in Colorado, but also to help build that conservation ethic that Colorado is so well known for. So those are sort of our two bodies of work, is education and outreach, things like this, which are always fun to do. Get out there and protect the land and water. And as we heard, there's lots of opportunities. If you go on our website, we do many field trips and educational opportunities to get out and actually see the work on the land. Build an enduring institution, which I will talk a little bit about later, and also support the land trust industry. So we're not the only land trust in Colorado. There's actually a number of local land trusts. And so as a statewide land trust, one of our missions is actually to try to work to support our fellow land trusts in the state. And I apologize, trying to get this closer. Okay. So I want to start with the idea of why land and water conservation even matters. And one of the things that when we talk about protecting land, the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people is the fact that there is a lot of public land in Colorado. Yet we primarily focus on protecting privately owned land. So really, in order to actually provide a starting point with where we work and why we do what we do, it's interesting to look at a map of Colorado that delineates, I'm going to hold this, to look at a map of Colorado that delineates land ownership. So what you're looking at is a map of Colorado, and Colorado has about 66 million acres of land. And about 57% or 38 million acres is actually privately owned. But there is a great deal of public land in Colorado. So when you're looking at this slide, what you're looking at is the green is federal land, Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management primarily. You're looking at the bottom left is the Southern Ute land, it's tribal lands. The blue are state lands. The purple are municipal and county-owned lands. And as you can see, those are primarily on the Front Range where there are robust open space programs, Boulder County probably being the most robust Boulder open space program in the state of Colorado. And then what you're looking at finally in the end is the yellow land, which is privately owned lands. So I'm going to start to peel away these layers a little bit for you. So we're going to take out the federal land first, and then you've got those, and then we took out the tribal lands, and then we'll take out the state lands. I'm going to go actually back 1 second. There's always a curiosity about the map of state lands in Colorado. When you're looking at this checkerboard of all these little blue dots, these are lands that are actually owned and managed by the Colorado State Land Board. And when the state of Colorado became a state, 2 out of every 36 sections, which are a section is a 640 acre parcel or a square mile. So 2 square miles out of every 36 square miles were designated to be given to the state land board. And those lands are managed primarily for revenue for public schools. So they're spread out across the entire state, and the land board manages those lands. And then when you take off those state lands, you see these municipal and county-owned lands in the purple. And then finally, when you take everything off, you're looking at now all of the privately owned land in Colorado. Now, of course, it's an interesting map because you can see where places probably that you love to go and recreate aren't necessarily yellow, and a lot of places that you might have never been are yellow. But the question is, why are these privately owned lands in the places that they are? And so the answer is the Homestead Acts. So if you're not familiar with the Homestead Acts, these were a series of federal acts which encouraged settlement in the state of Colorado and basically gave away what was considered unclaimed land at the time. For this conversation, we have to park the question of Native American lands because at the time they were not considered claimed. So these Homestead Acts didn't really recognize tribal occupation and tribes in Colorado. But what happened during those years, and it was between 1862 and 1934, you could basically claim between 160 and 640 acres of land that would be considered unclaimed. And if you improved that land and lived on it for 5 years, then at the end of that, you could file a claim on that land and basically get it for free. The going rate to claim land at that point was about $1.25 an acre. So during that time, between the years of 1862 and 1934, there were 108,000 applications for under the Homestead Act that ended up resulting in 22.2 million acres of land going from federal land into private hands. 22 million acres. So really almost a half of all the private land in Colorado was claimed through the Homestead Act. But when you look at the land and the map, I want to ask you all a question. If you're thinking about it's the late 1800s, you're coming across the country, you're looking for land to homestead and claim, and you can have 160, maybe 320 acres at the time, which was most common. What are the attributes you're looking for when you're looking to settle on land? Water. I heard water. That was an important one. Water not only for irrigation and for drinking, but also for transportation because there were no roads. So when you're dealing with wagons, a lot of times moving your goods and services, you were moving them on water. What other attributes besides water? Soil, prime soils. You have to, Colorado is a beautiful state, but it's not very forgiving when it comes to growing. So you're looking at better soils. What other attributes? Accessible. I mean, the mountains are gorgeous, but if you're in a wagon train, it's not exactly the easiest place to get to your spread if you're at the top of a 14er. So you're looking for access. You're looking for accessible places. And those accessible places were also more climate friendly. And then one other big one, wildlife habitat. So if you think about Colorado, in many places, you can't actually grow any crops except hay because it's so cold. But at the time, wildlife was your primary food source. So you had to have good hunting grounds. So you were looking at lands that provided water access, good soils, wildlife habitat, and accessibility. And so when you start to overlay other attributes on the state, it starts to give you a picture of where these lands actually were. So these are the major river systems in Colorado. You can kind of see that, the settlements really did follow the major river systems because of both water and also for transportation purposes. These are the major byways. Obviously, we're not here in the 1800s, but the roads and the highways of Colorado are only built in places that were accessible. And so these are places where people settled, and you can see where, the roads followed the settlements because these were accessible places. And then this is one example of wildlife habitat overlaid onto private lands. So what you're looking at is winter range for mule deer. And mule deer was a very important food source in the early days of Colorado. And so as one example, I'm going to make sure there's not another example. Sorry. No, so as one example is mule deer. So 95% of mule deer's winter habitat exists on private lands in the state of Colorado. 90% of sage grouse habitat is on privately owned lands. 90% of pronghorn habitat is on private lands. 70% of the winter range for elk is on private lands. And almost 100% of the feeding grounds for the sandhill cranes that come through the San Luis Valley twice a year, 100% of their feeding grounds are on private lands. So the impact of private lands on wildlife is tremendous, and that's a big driver for our work. And of course, another big thing is food production. So all of our local food in Colorado is virtually all of it is produced on private lands or connected to private lands. Even if you have grazing allotments or leases to run cattle or other things on public lands, you still have to have a private ranch operation or a private farm operation. So really, most of our food, obviously, in Colorado is produced on private lands. So what we try to share is, although we work primarily on private lands, and on many of the private lands that have been conserved or protected through Colorado Open Lands and other land trusts, maybe are not always publicly accessible, they provide important public benefits. So those are things like wildlife habitat, local food production, our waterways, outdoor recreation, obviously, outdoor education, and our view sheds. And even oftentimes when you're on a trail and you're on private land, or when you're on public land on a trail, you're still looking at privately owned lands. If you think about places like Kenosha Pass on the Colorado Trail or things like that, if it weren't for land protection, you'd actually be looking at a lot of development. The other issue that we deal with is just land and water are finite resources, and the development of the land and water resources in Colorado is really going at a pretty incredible pace. So if you think about, we have about 5.5 million people in Colorado now. We're looking at adding another 2 million people at least by the year 2050. So think about the idea of taking Colorado and putting in Colorado another Denver metro, not the city of Denver, but the entire metro area in Colorado, and try to imagine the impact that that's going to have on our land and water resources. It's a little staggering when you think about it that big, but if you break it down a little bit, every week we're getting another winter park in Colorado. Every month we're getting another city of Monte Vista, and every year we're getting another city of Littleton. That's the pace of growth that we're dealing with in Colorado right now. So for us, there's a sense of urgency and a sense of time that we only have so many years to protect these important open spaces before it's going to be too late. So that's sort of the why we do conservation. I want to talk a little bit about now how it works, the mechanics of land and water conservation. So our primary tool that we use for conservation is a conservation easement. And that is a voluntary legal agreement between a private landowner and an organization like ours, or Boulder Open Space, for instance, is another example that holds conservation easements. And these are voluntary, but they are binding. And once they're in place, they're permanent. And they not only are permanent for the landowner that does them, but they're permanent with the land. It runs with the land, as we say. So if a piece of land that's been put under conservation easement has been sold, that actual conservation easement actually transfers to the next owner. So it is a perpetual conservation agreement, and it's generally almost impossible to unwind a conservation easement. It takes you have to actually go to court and convince a judge that the conservation values that you were protecting no longer exist. So it's a very binding and a very serious agreement, but again, totally voluntary. So we always make sure that when we're working with landowners, they appreciate what they're putting in the conservation easement can't be undone. So when you do a conservation easement on a piece of property, you're giving up certain rights, which I'll talk about in a second, but there has to be legally certain attributes to the land in order for it to qualify for any kind of tax benefits for donating a conservation easement. Oddly, our business is completely governed by the IRS, because if you donate a conservation easement, that's considered a tax deduction. It's a possible tax deduction. So those rules are all sort of set by the IRS. And what the IRS said was that if you're going to do a conservation easement that's going to qualify for any kind of financial benefit, it has to have one of these four conservation values. So either public recreation or education, protection of relatively natural habitat. Those are things like wildlife habitat, and including things like farmland and ranch land. Preservation of open space, which means that it preserves a viewshed for a community. It has to be visible from a public road. It has to be visible from a community, not necessarily just the landowner. And finally, preservation of historic or important or land or structures. For instance, we have a small conservation easement out in Weld County that protects a bison boneyard from a Native American settlement. So that's a historic preservation conservation easement. So when you do a conservation easement on land, what do you usually give up? So we start by saying, if you think about land ownership as a bundle of sticks, you have a bunch of rights as a landowner. You have development rights. You have the right to subdivide that land. You have the right to mine that land if you own the mineral rights. You have the right to build roads on that land to access different places. So what happens when you do a conservation easement is you're basically giving up certain rights to that land. You continue to own the land. It is your land, but you've given up certain rights. So generally what our conservation easements do is they limit or prohibit completely the subdivision of that property. If it's a 1,000-acre property, you can't chop it up into 35-acre parcels and sell it off. We limit the homes and buildings on those properties pretty severely. Usually what we'll do is limit all construction to a small envelope, a building envelope where buildings have to be. There can be height restrictions, all kinds of restrictions on the buildings themselves, limited roads, no surface mining. We also require, in most cases, that if there is water attached to that land, that water cannot be sold off separately. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is to make sure that if the land is irrigated, it stays irrigated and it continues to benefit from that irrigation. But also what we don't like to see, and this was the reference to the San Luis Valley situation, was we don't want to see water that's part of a community taken out of that community and sent someplace else, because water is a building block. It's an economic building block for a community. And so the communities should be able to keep the water in their communities. And we have a lot of water moving around basins in Colorado, obviously, but for us, it's an important attribute for conservation easements. And then limited energy development. This is a little bit of a tough one for us sometimes, but solar, wind farms, things like that are actually not allowed to be on conservation easements under IRS rules. So it does prohibit things like solar farms and wind farms and obviously any kind of fossil fuel development. So this is just sort of a quick example of a conservation easement. That would be an unencumbered property, doesn't have a conservation easement on it. Maybe it's a 1,000-acre ranch. You put a conservation, if you don't have a conservation easement on it, that you can subdivide that land if you'd like. You can develop anywhere on that land that you like. But when you put a conservation easement on it, it obviously stays, the water stays, and then it stays undeveloped. So sometimes the question is, why would someone do this? You own a piece of property. Why would you give up certain rights on your property? Now, to do a conservation easement, there are some incentives, but you'll never receive the full value of your land through incentives. So in addition to somebody just having a conservation ethic, somebody wanting to see that property protected, which is always part of the equation, there are incentives that we can help provide and help attract for a particular conservation easement. So there's really two kinds of conservation easements. One would be the more rare version where some third-party entity would pay a landowner to put a conservation easement on their property. There are the local open space taxes often provide some of that money to incentivize those conservation easements. The federal government has many programs that can incentivize conservation easements. There's oftentimes programs, for instance, that are designed to just protect sage grouse habitat. So ranchers can be paid to put conservation easements on land that has sage grouse on them, or other species, or even sometimes shortgrass prairie or things like that. But purchasing conservation easements is generally a rarity because there really aren't there are incentives, but there's just not enough to satisfy the demand. So what usually happens is when someone donates a conservation easement, they will get the value of those development rights that they have now given up are assessed by an appraiser. And then that gift of a conservation easement is considered just like if you donated your car to Colorado Public Radio, or you donated a piece of art to a museum, you get the value of that gift as part of the conservation easement. And so oftentimes people will do it to help their estate tax situations. They might want to lower the value of a ranch so that when their children inherit that ranch, they don't have to sell off chunks of it in order to pay the taxes. So there's a lot of estate planning, a lot of other sort of financial considerations that go into conservation easement donations. I will say that the Colorado State University did a study a couple of years ago to understand what happens to the incentive money and to the tax benefits that go to landowners who do conservation easements. And what they found was that money actually stays in those communities, and almost $1 of conservation easement donation usually translates into $8 to $12 of economic activity in rural communities, because they'll fix the barn, they'll fix the fence, they'll buy an implement, they'll often use it to buy more land that's then conserved to kind of keep the process going. So it does have a kind of a trickle-down benefit to local rural economies. And then once we do a conservation easement, once we've completed a conservation easement, then what happens? Well, I talked about why part of our mission is to create an enduring organization, a strong organization, because once we do a conservation easement, we have now made a promise to taxpayers, to citizens, and to the landowner that we will steward and protect that conservation easement in perpetuity. And perpetuity can be expensive. So it's a long time to have to make sure that you can legally defend that conservation easement. We have to monitor every conservation easement that we hold every year. We have to answer questions for landowners. There might be some rights reserved in that conservation easement that somebody wants to exercise 20, 30, or 40 years from now. Maybe there's the ability to build one house, but they don't want to do it now. So for us, stewardship is really a huge responsibility. Once we have completed conservation easements, we have to maintain good relationships with the landowners. We have to make sure that there's compliance to the legal agreement of it. If there's a conflict, we have to figure out how to resolve it. Sometimes somebody does something and they say, well, we didn't realize that wasn't allowed. And, it's not great to have to go in and ask somebody to tear a house down. So the more we work on the relationships and things like that, the more we can actually, keep positive relationships with our landowners. And then, of course, sustainability, as I said. So we basically have created an endowment. And every time we do a conservation easement, we have to raise a little bit of money, put it in the endowment to make sure that we always have the resources to legally defend that conservation easement. So that's part of what we do. And then the other aspect of what we call stewardship is, we protect land, and then we steward those conservation easements. But more and more what we've been doing is going back and looking at some of the lands and waters we've been protecting to say, I wonder if we could make it a little better. If you've ever driven through South Park, perfect example. If you see some of the impacts that mining has had on some of the land and water there and some of the streams that have been just decimated. So what we're doing is going back and looking at how can we not only protect land, but how can we make it a little bit better? So, for instance, one of the things we were talking about earlier tonight is we try to go in and find places where the streams have been disrupted and see if we can restore the ecologic function of those. And so we're a relatively small nonprofit still, but what we try to do is work with nature. So we have stream and riparian restoration programs that we run around the state. That's been a big growing part of our work. But what we try to do is find places where we can use the materials right on the site to keep it all natural. And oftentimes what we'll do is we'll go in and use those materials and build what we call beaver analog structures. They're basically fake beaver dams. And for whatever reason, if there are beavers in the neighborhood, and we try to do this in areas where there are kind of beavers around, they will come in and usually within days take over the site. So once we do our little work, they'll either come in and they'll say, good start, and they'll keep working on it, or they'll say, you really screwed this up, and they'll tear it all down and completely restart. We have no idea how they choose to do this. But we've seen this all over the state where if we just get it started just a little bit, and then the next thing you know, we've got those wetlands expanding. We've got better fire breaks. We're slowing the water down. In times like climate change, where we're seeing runoff really fast in the spring, it actually slows the runoff down. And then we even see better water quality downstream when we do more of this work, because obviously we're filtering the water and improving the aquifers. And then, so this is kind of a couple of examples of before and after, where you've seen these streams where they're sort of sunken, they're rushing, there's nothing really slowing that water down. So we go in and we build these little beaver analog structures. And then the next thing you know, the water spreads out, the greenery comes up. It's better for fish habitat. There was a great example I think we did on our tour, which was at the top of Kenosha Pass, where there's a stream on the east side of Kenosha Pass. This is actually that stream. And so what we did was we built this up, and what we saw within one season was where there were no fish in that stream, now there's trout in that stream. And the other thing that was part of our plan was, if you've been over Kenosha Pass and you've seen a moose standing next to the highway, it's really fun to see the moose. It's not so great for the moose to be standing next to traffic like that. So what we try to do is attract that wildlife off the highway. And now we've got the moose generally spending their time back in these wetlands rather than standing right on the edge of the road. And I'm going to just mention one other piece of restoration. I don't have a slide for it. So what we are also seeing more and more in Colorado and the entire West is that more and more with water scarcity, land that is currently irrigated is going to have to come out of irrigation. One dramatic example is in the San Luis Valley, where we're estimating maybe 100,000 acres of irrigated land, and these are family farms, are going to have to come out of irrigation. And when you take irrigation water off of land that's been irrigated for 100 years, and perhaps it was kind of desert before it was irrigated, maybe it shouldn't have ever even been irrigated, you've completely changed the hydrology of the land. So what we're trying to figure out is, how can you actually do dryland restoration? How can you take land that it has to be dried up because of lack of irrigation water and turn it into something sustainable long term? And that's been also a very big growing part of our work, is to try to figure out how can we do this in places like the San Luis Valley or on the Lower Platte in Northeast Colorado. Because we think that once we figure out methods that are successful here in Colorado, this is learning that we can spread all over the country, because this is obviously something, all the reading we do about Colorado River Basin and things like that, we're going to see a lot of land come out of irrigation. So that's a growing part of our restoration work, is how to figure out how to create sustainable dry land. So finally, this just gives you a little bit of an idea of our impact. We've been at this for about 45 years. Not me personally, but we've been at it for a little while, and just gives you a sense of, we hold about 800. We've had a couple more since this slide came up. So about 815 conservation easements protecting about 730,000 acres of land around the state so far. And just to give you a sense of what 730,000 acres is, it's a little hard to imagine. But if you start with Rocky Mountain National Park, which is 250,000 acres, and then you add in the other 3 national parks in Colorado, and then you add in all 45 or 46 state parks in Colorado, all those parks together still don't add up to 725,000 acres. So this is actually a pretty significant impact on the ability to protect some of the best and most important open spaces in Colorado. And this just gives you a little bit of a sense of where our easements are. And you can see we, as a statewide organization, this is Colorado Open Lands portfolio, not all of the conserved lands in Colorado, but we tend to work in places where we feel like there are particular threats to natural resources and they're not served by a local land trust. So you can see where our primary areas of concern have been over the years. And I would say more and more what we're seeing is more interest in Northwest Colorado because there really still are large privately owned open tracts of land to be able to conserve. And the other is the lower South Platte Basin in Northeast Colorado. We're seeing more and more demand there because that's the best soils in Colorado. And if you want to preserve farming and ranching in Colorado, Weld County, which is about a quarter of the Eastern Plains up there, that actually is the 5th largest ag county in the United States of America. And so in order to protect that, we've got to protect those soils, because if you've driven up I-25 lately, God bless you if you have, you see the pace of growth up there, and all of those housing developments and all of that commercial activity is going on our best soils. So we're really fighting to keep as much of that open space as possible. So that's our story, and I'd be happy to take any questions or anything else. And I apologize for the sound if you're on Zoom.
You're going to get the lights, Carol? Good. Well, thank you, Tony. That was very informative, very interesting. Do we have any questions? Carol, here, let me bring you the microphone.
Do you work with the Nature Conservancy, or you do similar things? Or
yes, so I would say we do work with the Nature Conservancy quite a bit. We partner with them. The Nature Conservancy and Colorado Open Lands, and then there's local land trusts, sort of serve the spectrum of conservation needs in Colorado. So I would say that for us, we're sort of in the middle of the kind of conservation projects. The Nature Conservancy focuses much more on national and international policy, which we do not work on policy issues as an organization. And then when they might do conservation projects because they have the resources to actually go out and just purchase a ranch or something like that to do a conservation project. So for us, if somebody calls and says, I have 1,000 acres, if they call the Nature Conservancy will call us and just say, you should work with this project. And if somebody calls us and says, we have a $50 million ranch we want to sell, we're like, you got to call the Nature Conservancy. So it's actually a very good partnership that we have with national organizations as well.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah.
Hold on. I have to bring you in, but hold on a second. Sandra, do you have any questions from the Zoomers?
I don't see any yet, but I have one. I'm interested in who does this restoration work. Do you have a staff that does that work, or do you partner with people who have staff or volunteers or ecologists?
So we have, so we have 3 restoration staff people that manage a team of consultants, and we have pretty particular standards about the kind of restoration work we will do. We don't do things like bring in concrete trucks or anything that looks artificial. And so the contractors that we work with in Colorado, they're basically based in Colorado and Utah. We bring them in. We have every contractor we know that does this work, we have them booked for 3 years right now, because it's a high demand. So we generally will use contractors for our restoration work. Yes, sir.
How about Eagle Valley Land Trust? Eagle Valley Land Trust, you know them?
I know Jessica Folis and Eagle Valley Land Trust.
Okay.
Yes, and they're a terrific organization. And I would say that many local communities are actually served by local land trusts. So we do not generally do work in those communities with local land trusts.
We gave them a donation about 40 years ago, some land on the Gore Creek in Eastvale.
Okay.
That was one of the first pieces they had.
Oh, wow.
And then they worked downstream, then put that on downstream.
Okay. That's terrific. Yeah, they do a good job, Eagle Valley Land Trust.
Thank you, Gerhard. Sandra, any other questions from the Zoomers?
Yes, we do. Virginia has a question.
Hi, this was a great talk. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I was just curious if schools and universities approach Colorado Open Lands to conduct research projects, and if they do you allow that, and do you then have to work with the conservation easement holder to allow that project to go forward on their easement?
Yeah, so the question about working with universities and colleges, we do partner with universities and colleges on a number of initiatives, and we also partner with other nonprofits. And one example is Rocky Mountain Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. So what we do oftentimes, especially in our restoration work, is the funders of our restoration work. So we raise private philanthropy from our donors to pay our staff to manage these projects, but our staff raises then tens of millions of dollars in public sources to do this restoration work. So what happens is oftentimes those funders want to know, well, when you do a restoration project, what impact does it have on the aquifer? What impact does it have downstream water users? What impact does it have on water quality? For instance, when you did that project in Kenosha Pass, what did the water look like once it came out on the South Platte and eventually into Chatfield Reservoir? So we'll actually have students set up these studies where they can do these studies for their own academic uses, and then they provide us the data that we can then provide funders to say, yeah, so actually what happened was, the aquifer in South Park in this area came up because the water slowed down and it soaked into the ground before it just shot out of South Park, into the reservoirs. So there's a lot of opportunities to partner with research. The other thing that we do is things like wildlife surveys, bird surveys. So a lot of times we will actually ask landowners that we hold their conservation easements if they're willing to allow their properties to be used in wildlife surveys. And what we find is people who do conservation easements are generally conservation minded, which is great. So we've had a lot of partner organizations go out and actually do bird surveys and things, and on these conservation easements. We also do work with things like Preble's jumping mouse was an example we were talking about earlier, where we actually work to create habitat for endangered species. And so what we like to do is have people monitor those for decades sometimes to figure out what the impact is on some of this habitat creation. So it is a great partnership. And we like to think that our conservation, our portfolio of 730,000 acres of conserved land is a great canvas to do a lot of thoughtful research. And our landowners generally are very, very favorable to doing that. One of the things that is interesting about conservation easements is one of the things that's required in order to do a conservation easement is a thorough biological study of every property. We call it a baseline report because we want to get a baseline of what is that property like. And then each year when we go out and monitor that property, we can say, oh, you actually have more wildlife, or you have more native species, or you have more native grasses and things like that. So it gives us an opportunity to actually track our impact by having a baseline on every single property we've done a conservation easement on.
That was really good to hear about. Thanks. I have another question here from Alicia.
I'm picturing the sort of like map that you had up. I think it was just one slide ago where you had a map of the easements in the state in general. But there's a lot of pressures that you talked about earlier in your presentation: development pressure, energy pressure, population pressure expanding. Do you have any thoughts or kind of industry in general perspective on what you're doing to stay cost competitive? The price of land is increasing. There's a lot of often maybe options that landowners are considering, not only conservation, they may be looking at a different development offer, things like that. And while they might be conservation minded, is there anything that your organization or others like yours are able to do to be cost competitive?
That's a really good question. There's probably two parts which are interesting. First off is I believe there is a false narrative that conservation drives up housing costs in Colorado. It's just, I mean, those are great, all those dots, but we hold 730,000 out of 66 million acres. We're not touching or scratching the surface enough to actually impact housing costs. The other part of your question, though, is how do you deal with a landowner who's saying, okay, I own 1,000 acres of ranch land. I can get, $1 million in tax credits to conserve it. I can get $10 million from Richmond Homes. Don't want to pick on anybody in particular, from a housing developer to develop it. And so if a landowner is looking to maximize value, they're almost never going to do a conservation easement. What we try to do is we try to say, if you have any interest in seeing this stay open space, we will turn over every rock to try to find financial incentives for you to do this. So when we talk about like raising money to purchase a conservation easement, it's not from one source. We might actually go to Great Outdoors, Colorado, and then go to the Natural Resource Conservation Service and go to the County of Boulder and go to like all kinds of places and say, would you pitch in a little bit? Would you pitch in a little bit? And so the idea of fundraising for a conservation easement, we can't use private philanthropy to pay for conservation easements. One conservation easement is worth more than our entire operating budget in a year. So what we do is we go out and just try to find as many public sources and piece it all together like a puzzle and take it to the landowner and said, this is what we found. Is this enough for you to do the easement? Like I kind of said in the beginning, if you don't have a conservation ethic to start with, you're probably not going to do it. You have to make a sacrifice in order to protect open space. But if we can sweeten the pot a little bit, that's kind of where we try to find that spot. The other thing is that it's expensive to do a conservation easement. There's this biological surveys, there's all the legal work, there's the title work, we have to collect money for our endowment. It can cost $100,000 to do a conservation easement on a piece of property. If you don't get at least $100,000 of benefit out of that, a lot of landowners, ranchers and farmers who don't make any money don't have the resource to do it. So oftentimes we just have to find ways even to pay for their transaction costs. So it's a hard thing to ask landowners to do. They're already giving up a lot. So we try to make it at least as, feasible as possible financially.
Thank you. Just a second. Sandra, another question from the Zoomers?
Yeah, I have another question myself. We've seen a pretty rough stretch for public lands, the staffing and protection of public lands. Do you see conservation easements that focus on private lands as any kind of respite in this time, or is it harder to do that work in this time with other things going on? I'm just curious about how your strategy or approach has needed to change with a really different conservation stance from the federal government.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we have been saying for years, but has never really clicked for a lot of people, is when we talk about the delineation of land and all that federal land and stuff in Colorado, public land is not protected land. Public land can be leased for grazing, for mining, for forestry, for forest products, for lots of different uses. Plus, the recreational use on public land has a significant impact on wildlife habitat. You're thinking about ATVs and camping and all the stuff that goes on and hiking. It has a lot of impact. So what we try to remind people is that public land is not protected land. But when we do conservation easements on private land, that is often protected land. So what we see, for instance, is when we do a conservation easement, really good example is if you've ever been over Kenosha Pass, when you get to the top of Kenosha Pass and you're going into South Park, the entire drive from the top of Kenosha Pass into the town of Jefferson, all the way down that mountain, is all protected private land. It's ranch land that's owned. What we see during hunting season and during seasons of high recreational use is the wildlife migrates off of the public land onto the private land because it does provide a respite. So in many cases, protected private lands actually offer that protection for those resources who are able to move off. Plant species and things like that they can't, but often wildlife does. The other thing I will say is that, and it happens to be the cover story of the newsletter that I left outside, but when this discussion about selling off public lands became significant, in the beginning of last year, we kind of thought to ourselves, well, our lane is private land, and we can't really get too political or involved in this discussion about public lands. What we found was our phone started ringing off the hook from ranchers and farmers who said, like, look, I have grazing leases on private land or public land. And if they start talking about selling off lands in places like Gunnison or, the Northern Front Range or places like that, those operations will go out of business because they can't actually make a profit, or in some cases just lose a little bit of money without access to those public lands. And so what would happen is you'd have all of these ranches and farms going defunct with conservation easements on them, and no one's going to buy these things because no one can make any money running cattle. So what we found was the public lands discussion is very central to the viability of private lands. So we did have to get involved, and we certainly made our opinions known about our opposition to selling off public lands.
Thank you. Here, I have another question.
Could you talk about any conservation easements that you have in Boulder County?
So we have some conservation easements in Boulder County. We have some conservation easements on Boulder County open space land. And in one case, we actually have, is the Tucker open space is it open now? Okay. I don't know if it's publicly accessible. In one case, we actually owned 40 acres of land that someone gave us, and we gave it to Boulder County. And then we did a conservation easement on the adjacent public land and the land that we actually gave to Boulder County. So we partner with Boulder County. I will say Boulder, Larimer, Jeffco probably are such robust open space programs. They're bigger and better than us. So it's like we know when a community is well served, we try not to get in the way. So I think in this case, what we see is the open space programs they're so robust that, our little bit of private land conservation is probably better suited to be focused in other places. I will say that there are landowners who just simply philosophically will not work with a government agency. So sometimes a county will call us and say, we really love to see this protected. We have some funding to help incentivize it. That landowner will not work with us. Maybe they'll work with you. And we do that once in a while. And that's just, some people are just skeptical of government, so they want to work with a private organization.
Thanks. Sandra, anybody at your end?
I don't see others, but I do see a comment. Someone who says they are horrified by the development in Park County, south of Fairplay. Glad to see you have some easements down there.
Yeah, we hold about 25,000 acres of conservation easements in Park County. And I will say, I always ask this as a trick question during my my presentation, but have you ever been on a conservation easement? And the answer is yes. Everybody here has been on a conservation easement. If you've ever driven south of Castle Rock to, of course, the Buc-ee's thing brought that. Everybody knows about that now. But if you've ever driven that stretch of south on 25, everything from Castle Rock, where the development stops, into Monument is all protected. It's Greenland's Ranch. It's an incredible conservation easement. If you've gone over Levita Pass, from the top of Levita Pass all the way into Fort Garland, it takes almost a half an hour. That's all a conservation easement. All that land is protected. And of course, Kenosha Pass is another good example when you go over Kenosha Pass. So, people almost don't understand the impact that conservation has already had on protecting areas from development. And, if you ever go over Kenosha Pass at night and you look up into some of those hills, what you can't see during the day is hundreds and hundreds of 5-acre parcels that have completely been chopped up in those areas. So to your point, to the questioner's point, yes, there's tremendous development that people aren't even aware of. If you ever look at a map of the San Luis Valley on the Colorado State Gazetteer book, if you open the page to the San Luis Valley and look at it, it looks like a map of Manhattan. The entire San Luis Valley on the east side has been completely subdivided into 5-acre parcels. It's not developed yet, but it's incredible how much subdivision there is in Colorado that just hasn't even been built out yet. So it's pretty significant.
Wow. Okay, I had another one here. Suzanne?
You touched on this with your comment about Boulder County and some people not wanting to work with the government, but I was just wondering, for the most part, do people come to you and say, I want to put my land, I want my land protected, or do you see parcels that you think are really important and you go out and approach the landowners?
It happens both ways, but I will say that the vast majority of our work are folks contacting us. One example that we just had happen in Park County, we did a conservation easement south of Fairplay, down towards Guffey and Hartselle, if you're familiar with that area, on the side of a mountain. And it was a 400-acre parcel. And we had to talk to the neighbor on one side who had 1,500 acres because there was a fence line issue we had to get solved before we could finish the easement. Once they figured out what we were doing, they said, well, we want to do a conservation easement. And then once that neighbor on the other side, who had 2,500 acres, found out, they wanted to do a conservation easement. So what we started out to do last year was a 450-acre easement. We now have 4,500 acres of conservation easement. And we call that, contagious conservation. It's just, or fence line conversation. So most of our work comes to us that way. So once in a while, we will have, like, Colorado Parks and Wildlife will come and say, there's this ranch, and it is so critical to a migration corridor for elk. And that family does not want to work with the government. Especially with wolves now, it's a little tough. So they'll say to us, we'll give you the funds to approach them, see if they'll do a conservation easement with you, because they won't talk to us. So we get that as well. But the overall, we have had a 200,000 acre wait list at Colorado Open Lands for probably 5 years, because we do about 25 or 30,000 acres a year. And by the time we get those done, our wait list is refilled. So, and it's a capacity issue for us. You can only get so much done in a year. And then all these incentive programs are limited. There's only so much tax credit state will issue. There's only so much funding the feds have every year. So we have a wait list of, for some people 5, 7, 8 years before we can actually get to their project. So the demand is very high. So finding people to do projects is actually not the problem. It's finding the capacity to get them done.
Very interesting stories. Sandra, any new questions at your end?
I don't think so. Lots of people saying thank you in the chat, though.
Okay, I do have one more question here.
Hi. I was wondering if you knew of any other states that have similar organizations to Colorado Open Lands, or is this something that Colorado is leading on? Like, I don't know if you had a comparison to some other states.
Yeah, so there's about 1,600 land trusts around the country. In every state, there's land trusts. COL is about the 5th largest in the nation, just for comparison purposes. There's a lot of small land trusts. There's a lot of land trusts that serve one town or maybe one county, but there are a lot, and so it's it's pretty well known business. I would say that Colorado is when we go to conferences around the country and meet other land trust leaders, Colorado is the gold standard for land and water conservation, because we have a couple of incentives that no other state has. We have Great Outdoors Colorado, which takes lottery money, and 50% of all the lottery money that's raised through, all the whatever games are, goes to pay for land conservation. And then we have the ability for landowners, when they do a conservation easement, you can normally donate something of value, you get a federal tax deduction, which is great if you have income, but you don't have income, you can't really use it. What we have is a state tax credit, which means dollar for dollar for the value of your conservation easement that you donate, you get a state tax credit. The extraordinary thing in Colorado is that you can sell that credit to a buyer. So if you're a rancher who might have gotten a $2 million tax credit for doing a conservation easement, but you only have $20,000 a year of income, you can sell that tax credit to First Bank or Amazon, and you can actually receive that in cash. We're only one of 3 states that have a transferable tax credit. We're the only state that has a great outdoors Colorado, and we have an amazing federal agency staff in Colorado that has been able to not only get great allotments of federal money, but they're able to collect it from other states that don't use it. So, the long-winded answer is that our incentive program makes Colorado extremely unique in the land conservation world.
Such encouraging stories. Any more questions? Anything? Ooh, I have another one. This is Alicia.
This is a freebie for you, Tony. For those of us that want to learn more, do more, participate with your organization, what can we do?
So I would encourage you to the way for us to share what we do. Pictures are beautiful. It's fun to talk about the work. If you have an opportunity, on our website, every year we have a whole series of educational tours and hikes and visits and things like that. We would love to get people out on the land. Our landowners, yes, it's privately owned land, but they are so proud of what they've done. They love to have people out to talk about what they've done. So I would encourage, as a first step, we can always use financial support. Obviously, we're a nonprofit. But if you really want to understand what we do, look at our website, sign up for our newsletter, and on our email, we have a monthly email newsletter, which sends out dates every month of opportunities to get on the land. And oftentimes these are places that are privately owned that you're never going to have an opportunity to see without this kind of tour. So I would encourage everybody to just come on out and see what we do on the ground. It's really cool.
It sounds great. And Bev and I really enjoyed what we've done. Final call here. Any more questions? Well, then I think we want to thank Tony for a wonderful talk and encouraging us about good things that are happening.